Welcome, everyone. My name is Kelly Munn, and I'm with the League of Education Voters.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Kelly Munn, and I'm with the League of Education Voters. Welcome to our free online webinar series called Lunchtime LEVinars. We started this series over 3 years ago to share information and build knowledge on important and timely issues. And in a lot of ways, we built this webinar because of you. You have asked for this information, so we are pleased to have you on again. We're pleased to offer these webinars thanks to the generous support of our sponsors, the Boeing Company. And today we will hear from Sharon Navas from the Equity in Education Coalition, who will talk about a recent trip that the Equity in Education Coalition, along with LEV and others, put together to learn how California has changed their funding model to focus additional funding to close opportunity and achievement gaps. Sharon is the co-founder and executive director of the Equity in Education Coalition. This coalition was founded in August of 2012 out of a communities-wide, deeply felt concern about at the time, they thought it would justify even deeper cuts into the state safety net, including things like housing, healthcare, early learning, and higher education. The Equity in Education Coalition is Washington State's largest coalition of stakeholders from communities of color and white allies who are striving to improve educational opportunities and outcomes for children of color. Although they comprise a diverse spectrum of backgrounds, perspectives, and circumstances, there are three main qualities which I'm not going to cover that hold them together. Sharon herself is the first American-born child of immigrant parents from Guatemala and El Salvador. Sharon understands and values the complexity of being multilingual and multicultural in America. A native of New York City, Sharon moved to the Seattle area in 2009. Past professions include being a community organizer with Stand for Children, executive director of Perros Los Niños, assistant director of development for NARAL Pro-Choice America, deputy executive director for Ayuda Incorporated, and development coordinator for the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. In 2010, she was appointed as commissioner for the Washington State Commission on Hispanic Affairs. In 2016, she was appointed to the Board of Trustees of the Green River Community College. Sharon was in addition to this, Sharon was an advisory member for the Thrive by Five's Talk, Love, Pray initiative, a cohort member of Thrive by Five's Advancing Racial Equity Theory of Change in Early Learning, a committee member of the Washington State Education Opportunity Gap Oversight Accountability Committee, and Sharon is currently a member of the Advocacy Caucus, Community Network Steering Committee, and sponsor group of the Roadmap Project of CCER. She also volunteers for South King Council on Human Services and was a board member of the League of Education Voters and is on the steering committee of the Southeast Seattle Education Coalition. Sharon holds a BA in Psychology and Sociology from St. John's University. As you can see, Sharon is highly qualified to have this discussion around education funding in the state of Washington.
I'm exhausted just thinking about it.
So a couple of housekeeping before we begin. For many of you, you already know this, but for some of you, you're new to this. You'll notice a chat function on the right side of your screen. This is a space for you to pose questions to us. As always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us. You can do this either on the chat function or you can send an email to info@educationvoters.org. At this point, I'd like to welcome Sharon.
Thanks, Kelly. Okay, so I am going to attempt to, in 15 minutes, digest everything that took me about a month and a half to understand. So if I go quickly, please know that the PowerPoint will be available to you, and I also am available for email questions and much deeper debriefs later on. So California State Local Control Funding. In 2008, when the recession hit most of the country, if not all of the country, California was putting a robust $70 billion into education itself statewide. Throughout the recession, they cut about $20 billion from education because of the recession. In 2012, when then candidate Jerry Brown was running, one of the things that he was running on was an understanding that he was going to put $20 billion back into education, but where he was going to put it was going to be much more targeted, it was going to be much more localized, and it was going to go to closing the opportunity and achievement gap. One of his candidate forums actually included conversations around racial equity and social justice. At the same time, there was a robust group of coalition members, including the California Teachers Association, the School Board Association, business officers of schools, community-based organizations, and advocates coming together to talk about a much more integrated and purposeful way of putting money into education. They came up with their education equity points, which you'll see on the screen, including school finance, teacher quality, college and career readiness, higher education, ELL accountability, and school-based health. These are the principles in which they started moving forward and having conversations around educational equity, fair funding for schools, and looking at a much more robust way of funding education that would be student-centric and with the purpose of closing opportunity and achievement gaps in California. So what is local control funding formula? For school districts and charter schools in California, LCFS establishes a base, supplemental, and concentration grants in place of what was almost 60 categorical spending structures in the K-12 system. They've actually divided the revenue into three different sectors: revenue limits, block grants, and they did away with, I think it was like 59 state categorical programs that existed prior to 2012. The county offices of education, which mirror our ESDs, had a separate funding stream for activities which included oversight, professional development, and coalition building. You'll see on the screen that the original estimates for the Department of Finance for California in 2013 indicated an additional cost of approximately $18 billion, which included $58 million for the county offices of education, again, to offer oversight activities, instructional programs, and professional development. The Department of Finance estimates that it would take a full 8 years to implement the new funding formula, and we have to consider that they started this in 2012. So how local control funding works. LCFF provides a base grant for each student. So each student gets a specific amount of money, and the next slide, which we'll get to in a second, will let you know what that looks like. And they are divided up into class grades, so K through 3, 4 through 6, 8 through 9, and 9 through 12. One of the interesting differences between California and Washington State is that they only have 7 unified school districts, and so those are the school districts in which elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools feed each other, and they're under one specific school district, like Los Angeles United, Sacramento, Santa Clara. Other school districts are divided into elementary schools and high school districts. They're not like one geographical school district like we have here in like Highline, Bellevue. So that was a little bit of a learning curve for us. So you have your base grant, and then you have the supplemental grant, which is provided to school districts based on the ratio or percentage of low-income English learners, foster youth that they have in their districts. And that generates about 20% more funding above the base grant. And then a concentration grant, which is third and adds about 50% more of the base grant should your school district have at least 55% students who are generalized as high need. Those are your English learners, low income, foster youth, and homeless. So this is what the base grant looks like in 2016. Like I said, K through 12, each student is categorized as having $7,800 of services, 4 through 6, $7,100, 7 through 8, $7,400, and 9 through 12, $8,800. So this graph is a little hard to sort of understand. When they started putting the local control funding formula together, one of the things that they wanted to do was to bring every school district back to the 2008 pre-recession revenue streams that they had. So you'll see that in 2000, so they set the goal of almost $60 billion, like $57.5 billion. And in 2013, 2014, school districts were at 72% of the target. They had what you see in the gray area is the gap between what they were getting in terms of revenue and what the gap was to get to the 57.5. The 12% is that additional funding that states gave to bring them a little bit closer to closing that financial gap. And you'll see that the numbers sort of look a little weird. It took me a little bit of time to understand what the graph meant, but in 2014, 2015, school districts were about at 80% of target, with 30% of the gap from 41 million to 57 million being covered by the state. 2015, 2016, 90% of the gap has been covered, with 53% of the gap between about 47 million and 57 million being covered. And of the remaining gap of about $8 billion, 54 has been covered by the state. How is it funded? Well, California is funding education through 4 separate kitties. Revenue limits, which is a combination of property tax, general purpose state aid, which is allocated at the state level, and income tax. The state categorical is also part of the funding, federal funding, like Title I, Title X, all of that also comes into it, as well as local funding, parcel tax, leases, and fees. So in property-rich rural areas, they actually have a parcel tax. So Sacramento has about a 16% parcel tax that goes into this funding formula, whereas cities that don't have large parcels don't get as much of that percentage back into their funding structure. So one of the things that was really interesting about the trip when we were having these conversations was that so when we were talking about local control, one of the things that we realized was that before 2008, California had 50 categories in which a school district could spend their money. When they were given the option of having it localized and having school districts, community members, school board members, and principals be the ones to create the local budget, they jumped at the opportunity. But of course, one of the things that decision makers wanted to ensure, including the governor, was that there was some accountability, not just state testing and the budget review, but also accountability at different levels of the state. So they created what is called the local control and accountability plan. It is a 3-year plan that gets reviewed every year, and it is a 3-year plan that has to be created with local input, including families, community-based organizations, parents, teachers, staff, and students. It is actually written in statute that the local control and accountability plan has to show how the school district reached out to those specific groups of people to get input as to their budget and how they're going to start closing the opportunity gap. Each school district must focus on 8 priority areas, and the same 8 areas are throughout the whole state. So it's not like it's a couple of areas of priority. In rural areas, like the whole state has the same 8 priority areas. And you'll see that the community input is a core standard of the LCAP. And the LCAP and the budget go hand in hand. So you cannot pass your budget if your local control and accountability plan is not sufficient or doesn't pass muster. So you have to have both of them pass or neither one of them pass. So there are 8, like I said, there are 8 state priorities. You can go to the next. So the first one is conditions of learning, basic services, implementation of state standards like Common Core, Next Gen Science Standards, and English Language Development Standards, and course access, ensuring that all students have access to broad course of study required in subject areas like math, science, social science, visual and performing arts, health, PE, CTE, and language. The second cluster is community engagement. Student engagement, parent engagement, and school climate are part of the priorities set for California State. And then there is pupil outcomes, student achievement, and other student outcomes. In some areas, they use health access, food access, housing as part of their other student outcomes. So 2 things that were pretty interesting for us. The local control and accountability plan must include, and this part is written in statute as well, must include services that target each major subgroup, race and ethnic subgroups, low income, English learners, students with disabilities, foster youth, and homeless youth. On the other side of the screen, you'll see that there is the evaluation rubric, which actually falls in line with the accountability rubrics for Every Student Succeeds Act, which was passed in December 2015. Academic indicators, college and career, graduation, ELL, chronic absence, and suspension rates. So who holds districts accountable? There are different layers in which a school district is held accountable. The first layer is district staff, parents, student community, stakeholders. They all provide input and feedback on the district's priorities. After that, the District Board of Education will adopt the local control and accountability plan and do the annual update on the budget and request technical assistance if needed. The County Office of Education, which again is our ESD, will approve or disapprove the local control and accountability plan and provide technical assistance when requested. California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, which was a group created by Governor Brown when he first started this conversation, provides more technical assistance and support and refers districts that have not implemented recommendations or continue to struggle to SPI. And then the last layer is the State Superintendent of Instruction, which can intervene in districts that fail to improve outcomes of 3 or more student subgroups in 1 or more of the priorities in 3 out of the 4 school years, or as referred to by CCEE. So there are different multiple local, regional, statewide levels of accountability that offer technical assistance, offer feedback, offer guidance to the school districts, and allow for the school districts to sort of course correct as they're moving forward through the process. One of the things that was really interesting when we spoke to the Department of Finance and Education was the culture shift in which they started having this conversation. They were very clear that these systems of accountability are not punitive. They are collaborative, they are engaging and genuine. It was not, there was no sense of punitive damages, failing schools, none of that. It was how do we work together to ensure that we're closing opportunity and achievement gaps for all of our kids, and not just how do we make sure that you pass muster to something that we put out years ago. It was very, the feeling that we got was that it was very collaborative and very respectful of not only the struggles that school districts were going through, But the shift from having 50+ categories in your budget to now having almost complete control of where you're going to spend your money. So the timeline for California. The original weighted student formula was proposed by Governor Jerry Brown in 2012 and failed. A year later, after much community input, listening tours throughout the state, the governor unveils his local control funding formula in 2013 and passes. It passes remarkably well. So in June, the legislature passes the LCFF and starts looking at the California state budget with bipartisan support. In 2013, August of 2013, so about 2 months later, they start creating community engagement strategies. Now it's a whole statewide strategy that school districts buy into and start using for their own local areas. In 2014, school districts start implementing, they start drafting the first local control and accountability plan with community members. And since then, there have been hundreds of lessons learned, changes that they would make, bumps in the road that they've had to self-correct. One of the interesting things about California at this time was in 2012, between 2012 and 2014, they instituted the local control funding formula, Common Core, Next Gen, SBAC, and scrapped their data system as well as stopped all high-level staked tests except for SBAC. So they were really in a data vacuum of not really, which was good and bad, right? Because you sort of start fresh, but for our colleagues in every state who want to know what the percentage is that we've closed the gaps since implementing 2 weeks ago, it was a really hard conversation to have. But so far, the people in California have let us know that of the cities and school districts that have been implementing this, there have been clear, honest conversations about how to best course correct, what the lessons learned are, and what are the unintended consequences, both good and bad, well, more both positive and negative, that have come out of LCFF. So key findings and challenges and opportunities. Districts were not providing the level of transparency promised in exchange for increased spending flexibility. Most districts were missing the opportunity to use the LCAP as a comprehensive planning tool for continuous improvement. Many districts and LEAs were not fulfilling the equity promise of LCFF. Districts varied as to whether they adopted robust annual measurable outcomes, and some omitted legally required metrics to show how they were performing in the 8 state priorities. Most annual update reviews lacked the transparency necessary to serve as a robust tool for reflection and continuous improvement. And lastly, too many districts were approaching the LCAP community engagement set part as a checkbox instead of using it as a meaningful exercise in sharing decision making. But those districts that invested resources and partners with community-based organizations are now beginning to sow the seeds of real cultural transformation that is leading to increased student achievement. So in having these conversations, can you go back one? Sure. In having these conversations with the folks in California, one of the things that we noticed, and we spoke to members of the school board throughout California, the Teachers Association, the Governor's Office, the Department of Finance, SPI, the Business Office, the Association of Business Officers, school board members. And one of the things that we realized is that the biggest challenge, aside from, all the technical stuff aside, not enough money, very little professional development, the thing that was the biggest hurdle for them was the intrinsic shift in culture of we can now put money and invest money in the kids that need it the most without being punitively, without punitive damages coming to us at the end of the year because we didn't raise test scores. There was a lot of incentive for years for school districts to do the bare minimum or to figure out how to game the system. And California walked into this process with the idea that it was student-centric, holistic for kids, community involved, and that the idea of an educational system that was going to punish the institution for not being able to battle issues like homelessness, hunger, and other things that fall within the opportunity gap, they were going to push that aside. The California Teachers Association was very, very vocal about needing to do this for the benefit of kids first, and really understanding that it was going to be a hard road. It was going to have to be intentional conversations, and really putting not only their money but where their mouth was, but also putting students at the very center of the conversation around education. And of everything that we learned, that was probably the thing that resonated the most with all of us, and the thing that was spoken of the most in the 2 days and 30 people that we met with, was that the coalition that was put together with the intentionality of passing this, implementing it to the best of the law, and making sure that school districts, school board members, and principals and superintendents had the support that they needed to be the best school district that they could be for their local kids. So can we do this in Washington State? Absolutely. It will not be the California model. It will be something original to Washington State. But what it will take is a united vision for educational equity. It will take a pragmatic approach. It will also take an intentional and genuine coalition building throughout the state that resonates with both east side and west side of the state, and a commitment to the spirit of fair school funding and student-centric education.
Thank you, Sharon. This is our time to take questions. We've actually hit our normal deadline, but we're going to extend by about 10 minutes. If people have questions, we will go till 10 after. Folks who are listening, please type your questions in the chat feature on the right-hand side of the screen. Remember that really no question is too basic. In fact, I wrote down a couple of basic ones myself. So I'm going to start with some coming in from others. Sharon, we already have local control of budgets, I'm going to assume in this state, but lack of transparency prevents parents and local school boards from actually holding school districts accountable. How do we fix that?
Man, if I had one quick way of answering that question, you know, we do have local control, you know, but I think a large sector of it is having the transparency and having a fully funded educational system. Like, let's be honest, we can have as much local control as possible, but if the state is not actually taking on its responsibility to fully fund education as it should, as it has written into statute, then, you know, we're doing the best that we can with the little resources that we have. I think that if we take a look at our current allocation model, if we give guidelines that promote educational equity, community engagement, and offer ways to really engage our communities in a way that helps our communities understand what the budget looks like and really understand what is possible in their school building, I think we can work towards becoming much more transparent and accountable. The reality is that a lot of our local school districts outside of a certain sector of Puget Sound, our parents don't really know that they can be partners in their children's education, and we need to change the culture of expecting our parents to be there only when we need them to be, as opposed to be there throughout the whole year and throughout the whole process.
So do you think that the WEA would be on board with this?
You know, it's interesting. We're one of 5 states that does not have some kind of student-weighted formula or locally controlled formula, and all of the other states have had real good success working with their teachers union. The California Teachers Association was one of the first organizations on board with the transfer to a new, fair funding formula. The National Educators Association has come out with several reports saying that to achieve educational equity, we must create a funding system that is fair, localized, and accountable and transparent to the local school district and community members. So I would hope so.
Were there specific California districts that stood out in terms of using the LCAP as a tool for improvement and making meaningful traction toward equity? If so, can you please name them?
Actually, the ones that had the best community engagement when it came to their LCAP was the small rural communities, because they're all related to each other, or they all know each other, or they all constantly see each other in the supermarket. So community engagement for those small rural communities, and we're talking about school districts that have under 200, 300 kids. It was easy. You know, they engage in a different way, but they engage, and I think that's the thing that was shocking for us, was that there is no box for which school districts have to engage their community in any specific way. They could do it the way they needed to. They could do it in a way that was genuine to their community members and parents, and all they had to do was detail out how they engaged.
Sharon, you may have the answer to this, but just in case, I brought our policy analyst, Jake Vela, in the room, so he can back you up. The question is, for those of us who are just barely breaking into the practice of looking at education finance, what are some good resources that help us understand what the current state of Washington education finance looks like outside of the Leave Education voters?
Oh, I actually have a bunch of resources that I could send out. One-page PDFs, a timeline of what the budget looks like for specific schools, for all school districts in the state. You know, I am not a finance person. I started reading up on this a couple of months ago, and realized that there is a lot of technical work in school finance, but once you grasp a couple of concepts, everything else sort of falls in line. So I'm happy to share the resources that I have that sort of simplify school finance. The way I think about it is, if I were to talk to my barista, how would I explain it? And we've sort of tried to make it as simple yet complex as possible.
Jake, do you have anything you'd like to add to that about resources? I would say go to the, so this is Kelly. I would also recommend, this is how I started learning about it many years ago. Go to the OSPI, Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction's website, and look at their report. So they have a education funding report that really gives you the details of things like how paraeducators, how much money is allocated for paraeducators, the compensation matrix for teachers, how school levies work. It really gives you, for those of you who want to dig in and read an 80-page document, that's a great primer on how it all works.
And that's under the School Apportionment and Financial Services section of the OSPI website.
Since the legislature is still trying to reach a 2007-2008 level, what is the legislator's plan to resource up to a current funding level?
So they've actually 2 years ago, they passed one of their propositions in which they actually taxed themselves, both property and income tax, to a revenue limit. So the limit goes up, and there's a specific number, there's a specific percentage that automatically gets included for the cost of living increase, for rural, suburban, and urban cost of living, for demographic shifts, average daily attendance. So the numbers can sometimes change just a little bit. We're talking negligible, thousands of dollars. And there are some school districts. So one of the things that was really interesting about the way that they shifted this was that they actually held a no harm caused clause, which means that no school district got less than they were getting the previous school year. Most school districts got a small bump. A lot of school districts got a large, large bump. And we're talking about almost 1,100 school districts in one state. So when you look at the numbers of school districts that have a high percentage of ELL kids, have a high percentage of free and reduced kids, they're, because of the locations in which they are, some of them are not property-rich school districts, but they are huge school districts in that they serve hundreds of thousands of kids. So there is the state allocation to backfill whatever property taxes and income tax don't reach when they don't reach their limit. But they have been intentional about making sure that there is an ongoing increase in tax that goes specifically and only to education.
Does the California model have any direct implications for the levy swap model that was trial ballooned by Representative Ross Hunter in the 2014 legislative session?
You know what? That's a really big question, and I'm not going to be here for an hour and a half, so I'm more than happy to put that question together, to put an answer together and send it to Kelly and put it as part of the PowerPoint and recording that will be available online.
I'm going to do 2 or 3 more questions, and then we're going to wrap it up. If more questions come in, Sharon, would you be willing to answer some of them, and then we'll send it out to anybody who's on?
Happy to.
All right, thank you so much. How do California charter public schools fit into this accountability funding system?
So the charter schools are by law required to do the local control and accountability process. They are required by law to produce a budget, and there really isn't that much of a difference between what the charter schools have to do versus what the typical conventional public schools have to do in California. So yeah, there wasn't that much of a difference when we had a deep conversation about it.
How do our states' size and budget compare with California? The similarities in the structure and the differences?
The biggest difference is that we're nowhere near as big. We have 295 school districts. California has about 1,600 if you include charter schools. They have a robust, almost $70 billion dedicated specifically to education. That's like double our whole state budget, I think. Like, it's just, it's not comparable in size. It is comparable in demographics. We are beginning to have a larger demographic of free and reduced English language learners. We are unfortunately having an uptick in kids who are in foster youth and who are foster youth or homeless. And we are one of the only states in which the opportunity and achievement gap is growing. And California has actually started seeing a narrowing of those gaps. We are hopefully going to look at we are currently researching other states, and hopefully we'll be able to visit some others, including Massachusetts, New York, maybe Maryland and Colorado, because they have done similar work and have different demographics, different size. Massachusetts has had a student-weighted formula for almost 20 years. So I think if we were to take something on like this, it would have to be well-researched, and best practices from everywhere where we could do it in Washington State would have to be a part of the plan.
This is going to be the second to last question. I'll take one more after that, and then we're going to cut this off. What are ways that districts can learn to engage parents and be transparent that California offers to districts that struggle in these areas? And what about in Washington?
So one of the things that California school districts do, they go to where, and you know, it's something that we've said in Washington State years, they go to places where parents play, pray, and pay. So they, some school districts, some school board members have held school board meetings on a Saturday morning. They've held them early in the morning for parents who are driving far away. They have a huge migrant community, so they have their meetings later in the evening, offer childcare, offer food. Translation is a requirement in California, and there's not a lot of backlash about having to have translation services at meetings. The larger school districts were having a harder time because they have to reach so many parents at the same time. One of the lessons learned about California is that they have a parent trigger law in which every decision a school building makes has to be approved by 80% of their parents. So thank God we don't have that here in Washington, but it makes for some interesting conversations when you're a really large school district that houses, you know, 2,500 kids.
Why did California's weighted student formula fail in 2012? Was that a community readiness issue?
It was politics. The term weighted student formula did not poll well, so it did not pass well. Within a year, there was a lot of confusion as to what weighted student formula meant. There was a lot of confusion as to how it was going to be different from the 50-plus categorical spending options that California had at that time. So when Governor Brown came out a year later, he had done listening tours, he had done polling, he had actually gone, one of his campaign promises was to create a locally controlled funding formula, which is the way he explained it, and I guess it sort of stuck, and it resonated well with community members. It resonated well specifically with decision makers and administrators who could wrap their heads around what the new funding formula would look like, more so than a student weighted formula.
I'm going to do this last question because I think it kind of rounds out the whole discussion. How should we proceed in Washington State this year when the legislature has to fully fund basic education?
You know, to be honest, I don't know that we proceed this year. I think this year is a year for education for educating our legislators on what fully funding education looks like. It's a year for really understanding that the prototypical model has not been really good for our kids. It's a year for changing the culture of our state to really embrace, understand, respect, and acknowledge that there's a growing demographic shift in our state, and that brings with it certain challenges, certain assets, and our school board members, business officers, superintendents, principals, parents, and students have to be able to make localized decisions that are truly effective for their communities. And I don't know that the McCleary conversation and the student-weighted formula conversation are complementary this year. I think we have to push the state to fully fund education. I think we have to push the state to fully fund teacher compensation, class size reduction, and full day K for all kids. And then over the summer, we start the conversation as to whether we shift to something that's more student-centric, student-holistic, and student-weighted.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I think that we had a lively set of questions come in. People were very engaged in this LEVinar. Our next webinar will be an overview of the legislative session with our brand new Government Affairs Director, Daniel Zavala. So tune in then, and that will be, I didn't write the date down, December 15th?
20th.
20th, thank you. I also want to thank, besides Sharon, Sandra Gerard, who is the LEV's organizer in Spokane, for helping Sharon set up this trip, and Mary Furtakas, the consultant. All three of them worked hard to make this trip come off really fast, and everybody learned a ton, and everyone involved learned a ton, and now you also have learned from getting the benefits of this trip. And we will be posting more information over the next month. Thank you all for joining us. If you have any additional questions or comments, please send them to kelly@educationvoters.org. A recording of today's presentation will be available on our website. Please feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues, and thank you again for attending. We hope you will join us again. Bye-bye.